Michael, you had a very long BBC career. I mean, it's, 36 years, something like that.
36 years, absolutely. It's extraordinary how I got into the BBC. I applied for a job, a trainee TV cameraman at Television Centre, but I didn't have physics O level. So I went away to get that, and by the time I'd sent those exams off for marking, there were no trainee assistant TV cameraman places. So that was that. So I thought, well, let's just apply to anything at the Beeb and see what I can find. And a job in the Gramophone Library came up as a returns clerk.
Yeah.
And I remember going along to the interview. It must have been, I think it was in 5PP, although it could have been in Egton House. I can't quite remember, on the first floor. But anyway, there were several people on the board, a chap called Jim Palm, and Julia Miller-Timmins was the admin assistant. And we were chatting away and what have you. And Jim said, if you were offered a job in the Gramophone Library, when might you be able to start, in theory? So I said, well, I can't do anything before the end of this week because I'm going down to Somerset to the opening of my godmother's husband's steam railway, which Jim Palm says, well, I present Rail on Radio London. Would that be David Shepherd, the artist? I said, yes, it would. He said, fine, I'll see you there on Saturday. Come up to the press box and you can sit underneath my tape recorder so you get a good view, and we'll see you at 9:30 on Monday morning.
Brilliant. Steam enthusiasm, yes. Well, I share that enthusiasm.
Indeed.
Now, this was, 1975?
Yes, around about then. I left school in 1974 and went to work in my godfather's brother's orange squash factory. They made drinks for football stadia and cinemas and theatres and all that sort of thing, the sort of drinks you used to be able to get out of a carton in the interval. Yeah, so 1975 I got taken on, I should think it was around about the summertime, and my first month's pay that came in was £100. I don't know what that's equivalent to today, but the first thing my father said when he knew that I'd got in and I'd come home, he said, whatever you do, take out the BBC pension or whatever it is they offer you. He was a financial chartered accountant. So I said, yes, Dad, I'll do that. And I did. And however many years, decades later, he's sadly no longer with us. He hasn't been with us for 40-odd years or so, but he set me on the right track, and I'm forever grateful for his advice, because I'm now earning more than I ever did at the BBC without having to lift a finger.
So you had the foot in the door. That's the crucial thing.
Yes, absolutely, because once I was in the door, all the internal job applications in aerial were available, and you could have a look round and see what you fancied. My first boss was Steve Wright, would you believe? And he was never accepted on the BBC as a DJ or presenter. So he left the BBC and went to the commercial radio station in Reading. And the head of whatever it was at the Beeb heard this chap and thought, he sounds quite good. and the rest is history as far as Steve Wright was concerned on the BBC.
So what were you doing?
I was filing records. Do you remember those things? Probably most of your listeners will. Big black vinyl things with a hole in the middle,
Yes.
somewhat bigger than a CD.
Yes, indeed.
I was in the returns department, so the records would come back from all the studios, particularly over the weekend, where there was a great pile to sort out and put back on the shelves, huge shelves on the sort of half lower ground floor Egton House as it was then, because you could look out of the windows and see people's feet walking up the road that went up the side to the car park around the back of Egton House. And we would get records out, we would file records away. We even had a 78 record library, which was in the Langham, in the basement there, which was very seemed rather damp, very dark. I think there was one 40-watt light bulb that illuminated the whole of the 78's library, very narrow shelves, and quite often one or two people would be very naughty and either turn the light out and leave some poor sod there trying to find his way out, or make the sort of noises in the background, which would have them leaving the library toot sweet.
Vinyl, of course, is very popular at the moment. It's
It
had a
is.
revival. I must say, Shellac 78s have not. But it's
No,
interesting.
I own 3. They belong to my parents, and I sat on them, not all at the same time, but over a period of a few years when I was quite small. I was fascinated by the old wind-up gramophone. I put these 78s on, and I would put them down on the sofa, and I'd forget where I'd put them, and I'd sit down, and there was a crack, and that was that.
Yes.
But yes, so we did 78s. We did 78 cleaning, vinyl records, and did we have 45s? We must have had 45s.
You probably did, yes.
Yeah, because all the
pop releases.
exactly, and the hit parade on a Sunday evening with Fluff, wasn't it? Fluff who did top 40 on a Sunday evening.
Yes, I think so. You were just dealing with recordings coming back.
We were dealing purely with records coming back.
Yeah.
We would also deal with new records that had been purchased and were brought into the library. So there was what they called a bagging desk, where whoever would be up, Renato Warburg or people upstairs on the upper ground, I suppose it was, and the first and second floors, they'd order recordings in. They would come to us. We'd have to stamp them with BBC Gramophone Library, trying to avoid covering up printing on the label in the middle, which is quite hard to do.
Yes.
Put them in bags, give them their appropriate numbers, and file them. I think there were about 3 or 4 copies of each recording, and file them in the cabinets.
How were these things catalogued?
Well, upstairs, which was where programs would go and say, I would like this, that, and the other. There was a huge card index on the first floor, which overlooked BH to one side and BH extension as it was on the other side, and they'd have various people who specialised in different types of music for different sorts of programmes, and they would go and find out which recording they wanted. They'd then come down to the library and collect them themselves, as far as I remember, and then they would be dispatched to the programme, in time for their recording or transmission or whatever it was that they were doing.
Yes, but systematically, how were they arranged? Just
they were
acquisition
arranged
order or what?
So the card index was in, take classical music, composer order,
Yes.
A to Z, or I think there may have been a cross-reference for artists, so it could have been orchestras, it could have been soloists, conductors, pop singers, whatever. They'd be in alphabetical order as well, presumably by surname, and then they would see what the record number was, and then they'd come downstairs to where we actually held all the records, and select the disc by label. So you'd start off with Argo. What was it? Argo was a label, wasn't it? And there was Decca, and there was Polydor, and there was a whole mass of them. But they would all be filed alphabetically by record label. So people just hoped there weren't too many record labels that began with W, because they were down the other end.
But you come in as a producer, not really knowing quite what you want.
Yeah.
And you want some advice. And this depended enormously on librarians really knowing their stuff.
Oh, absolutely, and they certainly did know their stuff. They would go up and stick their head. I mean, they could either go into the catalogue and have a look for themselves and pick out what they wanted if they knew, but if they didn't know what they wanted, or they had a certain type of program that they were going to produce, they'd go and ask the appropriate person. There were people, I think, who looked after certain programs.
Yes, specialists in
that,
of music,
and they were all specialists in their own fields. And they said, well, perhaps you ought to try this, or this, and they'd get the records out and they'd go away, and the producer would then be able to have a selection of things to choose from.
Yes.
So it was quite a fast turnaround area, because people they had libraries in Charlotte Street, and there was the Ariel House in Wigmore Street. There was another BBC building, and of course Television Centre had one. Bush House had a library, and so there would be there could be an interchange of recordings between the different libraries depending on who got
Yes.
the recording they wanted. So I mean, it was a sort of BBC-wide facility that people could make extremely good use of. And then, of course, jumping way on, just as a by the by, producer choice came in when I was at Bush House in the 90s, and it was actually cheaper to go out to Smith's round the corner and buy your CD for £10 rather than pay £25 or whatever it was for this producer choice.
Yes. The famous example of how producer choice was really rather absurd.
Well, it was rather. Can I tell you a story about John Burt, which you can cut out if you want to? When we were at Bush House, this is leaping on a bit, he came to see somebody or do something at Bush House, and one of the lifts was taken out of operation. We think it was the padded one. There was one padded lift because they moved equipment about. And I think they put John Burt into that one, but nobody could use it. You can't use that. This is John Burt's lift. We said, well, don't worry about him. Programs are far more important. Just let us get on with where we need to be, and et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, he turned up, and as he was getting in his BBC car in the car park, which was in, it was between South East Wing, North East Wing, and Centre Block, a newsroom window happened to open on the 4th floor of the South East Wing, and a loud voice shouted, "Bastard!" And the window shut very, very quickly. And he then drove out of the building.
Okay, now let's move back into the sequence. So you were there. Were you sending recordings out to bits of the BBC that needed it?
Oh yes, things must have been sent out to the regions, for example, by internal post, probably around the rest of the BBC. Or Radio 2 had Charlotte Street. I worked there for a few weeks, and we'd get stuff sent over internally from BH to Charlotte Street for the producer, and they come and collect it. There was quite a lot of footfall from producers and assistants and all sorts of people actually into the library to come and collect things, particularly if they were local, and it didn't have to be posted. It was probably a quicker way of doing it in the end.
But a very important service now completely superseded by streaming, presumably.
I just don't know. I would have thought they'd have to have some form of either physical or a digital form of something or other that they can play when they want it and not stream it from over the internet or anything like that.
But then there's also all the recording of the needle time and
absolutely, yes,
performing rights and all those things.
There was all those forms had to be filled in by the production secretary, and they were returned. I remember in local radio we had a computer that you'd scan the barcode on the LPs or the singles or whatever it was who were using it while the record was playing, and it would log automatically the duration that you used and what the record number was and the artist and all that sort of thing, and it would do an automatic return. I think in local radio they paid a fixed fee per year for an average usage, and then the actual recording of what was used would be matched against it to see if it was over or under. I never got involved with that. I just had to remember to scan the stuff when I played a record. That was the important thing. Or you'd had to do it manually and write it down and send it to somebody or the program organizer or somebody.
So after doing that job, what did you do then?
Well, I didn't actually move up through the Gramophone Library. I sort of moved slightly sideways to Sound Archives, which was in Broadcasting House on the 5th floor. And that was tremendous because at lunchtime we were allowed to go into the where they stored all the tapes and the 78s and all sorts of wonderful things, and listen to a whole host of broadcasting up to, when would that have been, about 1978, something like that, from when broadcasting began. We couldn't use the wire recorder replay machines. Yes, that's right. They had to go somewhere to somewhere within the Beeb that was specialist for actually transferring those off.
But there were 18-inch discs, weren't there?
Yes, there were. We didn't see an awful lot of those, even if we were allowed to touch them, because I would presume that they were rather delicate,
Yes.
and if you didn't handle them properly, they could have been destroyed. There were no doubt tape backups at the
Yes.
time of all these sorts of things, so you could probably listen to tapes of things that were wax cylinders and heaven knows what. But that was quite fun. But people would come up and say, we're looking for a recording of whatever, and there were, again, I was sort of on the front desk where people could either bring stuff back to us and I would file it away in the Sound Archives library across the hall, or they'd ask one of the specialists. There were 5 or 6 specialist people who knew the archives backwards. So they could immediately advise what was available or when it might be available if it was being borrowed elsewhere, all sorts of things. They really also had specialist knowledge, like the gramophone librarians,
Yes.
for commercial music.
This was all BBC material.
All BBC
archived
material, yes.
material.
Yes.
Now, in television, in those days or before that, it was routine to record over tapes and things like that because they were so expensive.
Yes.
But audio tapes have always been very cheap. So presumably virtually everything was kept.
Let me answer it this way. There was a group of what people called selectors, and they would go through the output not only of the week just past, but way back, way back, to see what was still available. And they would select particular items that were worthy of creating a sound archive. So no, not everything was kept, but specific things were kept. I mean, events or obits for people, or something very unusual, or a very special broadcast.
Yes.
These things were selected to put into the library. There were quite a lot on LP, as far as I can remember, which I think were made by transcription services, because the programs would have all been recorded onto 10-inch spools, and then I think they would transcribe them across to LP and distribute some programs to foreign parts to replay locally. This was before the BBC. I mean, I wasn't in the World Service then, so World Service was only shortwave. But when the BBC became available on FM in nearly every major city in the world, I think they wanted it to be in every major city in the world. The BBC would send out recordings of programs, because the programs that were sent out were sort of when I was still at school. So programs from the 60s, like Round the Horn and all that sort of thing. They would be sent out on disc to local stations that the BBC, or who were affiliated with the BBC, for them to play out locally. But no, not everything was kept, but highlights of specific moments in history were kept.
What about news?
We didn't have anything to do with news at all,
didn't. That was
other
separate.
than I assume if there was a particular broadcast that somebody had died or had been killed or whatever, that news broadcast may have been kept in the archive, but then there may also have been a news archive as well. I didn't have anything to do with that side
sure
of
there
it,
was,
and it was all sound. There was no pictures. It was purely a radio sound archive, so there was no videotape or anything like that. But that was quite interesting. I suppose I was there for about 6 months or so, and Tony Treble was the boss, and he did an enormous project with Grace Wyndham Goldie and various people of that ilk and era. I think it was an audio history of the BBC up to that point. I would have to look that up and see what it was, but Tony Treble took on this quite big project to probably not dissimilar to what we're doing here, about the early years of the BBC, from all these sort of quite high up people's perception and recollections. That led on to international recordings. It was initially called foreign recordings. You mentioned needle time before. Foreign recordings dealt with music that was non-needle time. So it was music that was recorded abroad, usually in Europe, possibly further afield, and there was a special agreement between the BBC and the Musicians' Union that needle time wouldn't need to be paid on these recordings, which was very useful for local radio, which obviously had a limited budget. And foreign recordings became international recordings. They produced BBC internal record label called Radio Play. And we would get quarter-inch tapes, usually open tapes, not on NAB spools or anything like that. They'd just be open tapes on a platter, come in via Heathrow, through the BBC's office at Heathrow, along with the From Our Own Correspondent tapes from the United States. And we had a desk that dealt specifically with the airport and what was coming in and what was going out, and airway bills and all sorts of things like that.
Yes.
That was down one end of the office. And then we had a transfer suite, as far as I remember, at the end of the 3 or 4 offices that we had, that would transfer the material from the broadcast station, whether it was ZDF or whoever it was in Germany. We'd copy the tape, and I think we'd probably send the tape back, the master tape back, and from that they would then make 20 or 30 pressings of each recording onto the Radio Play label. Part of my job was to listen to each track, note down the duration of the track, the intro, the composers, find out the copyright, so we could put all this information on the sleeves, and they were all sent out to local radio, which in those days numbered 20 stations around the country, and so that was their source of cheap music. But it was pretty decent music, whether it be orchestral or poppy or Radio 2 style or whatever. There was quite a broad spectrum of music there. And they also produced something called LRST tapes. They were local radio soundtrack tapes, which came from the radio film unit at Maida, Vale. The radio film unit would produce, from commercial film soundtracks, with the blessing of the film companies, audio packages for film releases, so that Kaleidoscope or film programs, network or local radio can use these tapes, bit of music, few clips from the first 20 minutes of a film, closing music if there was a song or something like that on it, and these would all be sent out through foreign recordings, international recordings in BH, to all the local radio stations, along with the Radio Play records as well. And the chap in charge of international recordings was the late John Ross Barnard, who sadly has passed away fairly recently, I think, within this year, and his assistant, Oliver McFarlane. And Oliver went on to produce and direct proms and what have you.
Absolutely. Television director and producer, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. A couple of very nice people. And I don't know whether you want to include this story or not, but I remember one day I turned up in the office, and John called me into his office. He said, "What's this about banning beards at the BBC?" I said, "I beg your pardon." I was growing a beard, you see, and apparently in the previous Friday's New Musical Express, front page in huge letters was "Beards banned at the BBC." And I read this, and it said that in certain parts of the BBC you weren't allowed to grow a beard without permission. And apparently this story was relayed in the pub or the club one evening, and it was relayed to a chap who wrote for the New Musical Express, or NME, and it got published.
Information, I mean, presumably not true. There was no BBC policy, or was there?
Oh, no, I don't think there was. I think it was some journo had said, "Oh, this sounds good, beards banned at the BBC." That makes a terrific headline.
Alliterative, or whatever the word is.
Yes, exactly. Yes, one of those funny things that happens. So as a result of working with the film unit at Maida Vale, a job for a clerk's post came up in Maida Vale. So I applied for that and got it, and worked with a wonderful chap called Barry Littlechild, sadly no longer with us. The team of presenters there, who were Ray Moore, David Bellon, Michael McLean, Nick Jackson. Ray Moore did the Monday movie quiz on a Monday night on Radio 2, and the other three would present between them over a number of years Star Sound and Star Sound Extra, which were two other film programmes that went out during the week.
Sound programmes about film?
Yes, that's right. They'd either be about new releases or historical films. They get somebody in to... We used to work with Marjorie Bilbo, who was married to Tony Bilbo. Marjorie did Screen International, so she would come in. She'd often appear on programmes talking about films and everything. And Lynn Fairhurst and Wendy Clay, I think both of them would produce for those programmes. So when we got the feature films in to watch, or we'd go to the West End and with a couple of Nagaras and plug in to the preview theatre sound boxes on the wall to record the films when they were being shown, they would produce much more in detailed programmes about stars or films or music or composers and anything to do with film, producers, directors, all that sort of thing. So they produced, Maida Vale produced 3 Radio 2 programmes per week, every week, for a number of years.
That's interesting. I had never heard of that, and that's a little specialist area of the BBC, tucked away.
We were tucked away between the radiophonic workshop on one side,
yes,
with the wonderful Dick Mills and all his team of clever people and whizzes with electronics, and on the other side there was the BBC Symphony Orchestra office.
Yes,
and of course there was Maida Vale 1, so we could listen to rehearsals, or in fact sometimes you couldn't help but hear rehearsals going on if it was a particularly loud piece of music.
Yes.
To digress slightly, I belonged to the BBC Club Choir as one of my social activities in the BBC. And Ron Corp was the conductor for that.
Was he indeed?
Yes,
right.
Indeed. Ron, of classic FM fame and British light music classics and all sorts of things. And composers which had never been recorded before or very intermittently recorded. Ron would find all sorts of pieces of music that he thought worthy of recording, and so he would go out and do that after he'd left the BBC. Well, we, as a result of Brian Wright and Ron, we were invited to join forces with the BBC Symphony Chorus and the orchestra to take part in Berlioz's Grand Messe des Morts, conducted by Brian Wright at the Albert Hall. 4 brass bands in 4 corners of the Albert Hall and everything, and soundproof studio. We were all in there. 4 brass bands, 16 timps, big chorus, big orchestra, going hammer for tongs or whatever the phrase is, singing away like hell, and it could be heard in the street outside. Yes, we made such a din. That was one of the great. That was very exciting to do that.
So yes, the BBC Club Choir, interesting. So tell us a little bit about the club itself.
Well, the club in 1975, all right through, I suppose, until 1990 or so, in its sort of heyday, they had masses of sections. There was the club choir, there was SAG, the Studio Amateur Dramatic Group, which I belonged to for a bit, which gave me my first experience of S1 in BH, where I think Logie Baird did his trials for television. There was presumably there still is a plaque just outside the studio which gave you the dates and what went on in there, but I think that's where they first tested television. And we rehearsed in S2 just up the corridor. So there was SAG, there was a Stamp Club, there was a Railway Club, there was the BBC Organ Society, which was run by Barry Rose, who later went on to be director of music at St Albans Abbey, and has written a lot of responses and for even songs and all that sort of thing.
Yes.
What else do we have? There was a Railway Club. It was in the Langham. They put up a huge layout every so often in the larger of the 2 restaurants. I say larger of 2. There was a big restaurant in or canteen in the Langham, and they'd use that to put the railway stuff up. There was a flying club, there was a sailing club, there was a riding club. Yes. You could do anything that took your fancy. Oh, there was a film society. I got my music from the BBC Club Choir. I got my interest extended in music and organ music through the Organ Society. I got my interest in film and videotape through the Film Society, because they would allow you to borrow low-band U-matic camera recorder sound gear, lighting, and all that sort of thing. So I did various family weddings with that. And we edited in their little edit suite that they had at Lime Grove on 3 machines, tape to tape. So there was a whole host of things. And because Ron was librarian at the Sheet Music Library in Egton House, he had access to all sorts of stuff. So we would get all our music, free loan music from Egton Music Library to do our concerts. The sort of pinnacle of Ron's career with the BBC Club Choir and the choir's most exciting concert was a concert at St James's Sussex Gardens, just behind Lancaster Gate Tube Station, where in the first half we did Vaughan Williams' Sea Symphony, and just for good measure, in the second half we did Carl Orff's Carmina Burana, which was quite a feat to put on. He got wonderful musicians. I don't know where he got his musicians from, but we had wonderful orchestras. A standing room only concert that was. But we did a lot of concerts there. We used to do carols at Oxford Circus, and we'd do the BBC, the BBC Christian Union carol service at All Souls, which was fun. And then when I moved to Bush House, there was a sort of a sub-choir, nothing to do with the BBC Club Choir, but there was a Bush House choir that would sing Christmas carol services for the Beeb staff at St Mary le Strand. Well, having done various plays with Studio Amateur Dramatic Group with SAG, I remember the first time I stood in front of a 4038, a ribbon microphone to those who don't know, and my voice went up and up. I couldn't breathe. So I trained myself to speak down a bit, not speak down to the audience, but to lower the pitch of my voice, because it was a question of breath control, singing useful for that, and getting your voice in the right sort of audio space, if you like. Again, singing was useful for that. Although people like Brian Kay, who used to be the wonderful bass in the King Singers when they first started, incidentally this week we do in Dorset and various other places around Europe, is run by Jeremy Jackman, another former King Singer, wonderful chap to work with. And Brian Kay, I saw him one day at Highgate Choral Society, where Ron Corp still conducts, and I said, because I could hear his voice was not the voice, the bass, sonorous voice that he used to have. And I said, do you do much singing, Brian? He said, no, broadcasting ruined my voice, because he was just talking to a microphone 6 inches away, and he wasn't using his lungs, he wasn't projecting, he wasn't using his vocal cords properly. I say properly for a singer. And he did so much stuff for Radio 3, I think he did, and radio programmes, that he didn't use it as a singer should use their voice. But I tried to keep I would keep that in mind and try and keep a balance between talking and singing, and try and keep control of both of them, which is sometimes quite hard, because the breathing can go to pot in singing, but it's fine when I'm reading, or it's vice versa.
But when was the first time you actually did some talking into a microphone?
First time in anger was when he turned out to be my best man, but a chap I'd met in the BBC choir, in the BBC Club Choir years before, a chap called Tim Donaldson. He was a travelling engineer for the BBC, and he went all around the country. It turned out that I was living in Hemel Hempstead, and he was about to open BBC Radio Bedfordshire up in Luton. And I said, this sounds very interesting, Tim. Could I come and have a look around one day? He said, yes, of course you can. We'll get the station set up, and then I'll sort of let you know when to come. So I went up and had a look around. Oh, this looks quite nice. And BBC Mark III desk, famous desk for local radio people, built-in house, of course. And I thought, this is quite interesting. So Tim said, well, do you think you could operate one of those? And so I nodded in the negative and said, yes, I'm sure I could. So he said, all right, well, come up on Thursday and I'll give you 3 hours training, and then you can help run as a technical operator, a TO, on Sundays, the output. So, all right then. So went up for 3 hours training, learned how to do the Mark III desk, learned all about clean feed and what you do with the telephone and all this sort of business. And I was on the air the following Sunday at 7 o'clock in the morning. They had a religious programme from 7 till 9, I think it was, on a Sunday morning. But this particular Sunday morning, there was a religious festival up at Castle Ashby House in Northampton. Radio Northampton were doing a broadcast from there, but they didn't start until 7:30. So the religious producer at Luton said, right, I'll give you a pile of records of suitable Sunday morning religious type stuff. Play what you like, say what you like, just make sure the needle never stops moving, and you'll be absolutely fine. So I had to come out of Radio 2. Was it after the news, or did we... I think we started with the news. Yeah. So I had to put the Radio Bedfordshire news on, coming out of the pips. News happened. I then had to present the programme for 26 minutes or whatever it was, and do a simultaneous mix into Radio Northampton on split cans. This is the first time I had ever been on air. So I had Radio Northampton in my left ear, I had me in my right ear, and I had to read their script at exactly the same time that they were reading theirs, and open the appropriate fader so it all linked up very smoothly with Radio Northampton. The trouble was, by the time I got to the name of the location, my brain couldn't cope any more with it. Right. And I said, now we go over to Radio Northampton and join everybody at Castle Ashby House. Castle Ashby House didn't come out quite like that, but... and my now wife was listening, and I think she was more nervous than I was. So that was the start of it. And then I went on, and I used to drive the radio car, both physically and transmission-wise. We went out with little Kubi boxes to vote to sports halls when there were local elections on. We'd go and do outside broadcasts on a Saturday and a Sunday. RAF, not RAF Cardington, but at Cardington, where they have the amazing, I call it the blimp airship, which now lives up there. But they were airship hangars for the wartime, and we do open day there, and the fun fair and all sorts of things going on. So it was a very local, the whole point of local radio. It was locally based and featured all sorts of activities. And I remember interviewing test pilots up at Cardington, and I was always taught, if you're interviewing somebody, start your question with a W or an H. And then you're bound to get an answer. So how, what, where, when, and who. And you'd always get more than yes or no. You never to say to somebody, are you doing so and so and so next week? Yes. Yeah. And that would be that. But if you what are you doing next week? They'll tell you. And if you're lucky,
that's an interesting bit of advice. I just remember that.
Yes, you get two or three sentences out of them while you were thinking of the next question to ask. As long as you listened to what their answer was, that was the other important thing. Listen to what the interviewee is telling you. Right. Have your notes of what you want to ask, but craft them to what is being said, so it sounds as though you're listening to what's going on, which sometimes doesn't always happen, even today. Well, interestingly enough, tied up with local radio, I was basically doing technical stuff on local radio. I used to read the Italian football results on a Sunday night because there was a big Italian community in Bedford, and they loved to know what was going on in the Italian football league back home and all that. So that was quite fun. But linked with that, the only interviewing I did was when I was out with a radio car and somebody else, and we were doing an OB. And they said, go and interview so-and-so about, something that was happening in the local area, or there was a particular, we had some JCB diggers at one sort of summer event we went to. So take a Ewer tape recorder, Michael, and go and stand in the cab and interview a JCB digger driver as he was doing what he was doing, you see. The thing was that the JCB digger driver wasn't just digging a trench. He actually stood the digger up at about 50 degrees on each bucket, one front and one back, and I was hanging on for dear life with a ewer around my neck and a microphone and saying, what are you doing now and how do you do this, etc., etc., etc. That was sort of basics for learning to interview and that sort of thing. So there's no sort of, if you like, official training courses, although I did have a presenter's course offered to me at Radio Bedfordshire from Len Jackson, who was a Radio 2 announcer or newsreader. I think it was Len Jackson, lovely chap. And he said, yes, keep doing what you're doing. What experience have you had? And I sort of told him, i.e. not much. And he said, you have the ability to read and make interesting what you're saying, and you don't do it in the rather, as he called it, sing-song local radio way of doing things, if you know what I mean.
I'm sure you'll give me a demonstration of that.
Well, it was sort of, here is the news for today, and like this sort of thing. And I just read a story, basically. I would be given a news script, read the story, understand what you're reading, because if you don't understand what you're reading, the listener's not going to know what you're talking about. It also all depended how the script was written as well, of course. So that was just a sort of a sideline little bit of training, which Radio Bedfordshire kindly offered me and I took, which was very useful. But at the same time as doing local radio at a weekend, I was working at television film studios at Ealing. I'd moved from, actually, slight shortcut here, when I left Maida, Vale, I went to work at the co-productions film unit, for want of a better phrase, in Villiers House at Ealing. Because I was interested in film, having worked in radio play in BH and had moved on to the film unit at Maida Vale, it then seemed like a natural step to take when an advert for an assistant with a lady called Rosie Pedrick at co-productions based at Villiers House came along, which I then proceeded to board for, and I got the job. At the same time as that, I was doing my local radio weekends as a TO, a presenter and a technical operator, and I was offered the opportunity of being a newsreader for BFBS, because the drive time presenter at Radio Bedfordshire, a chap called John Territt, he said, my wife works for AA Roadwatch at Stanmore. Do you fancy doing some freelance shifts there? And I said, it's Hemel Hempstead to Stanmore. I mean, it was a weak excuse because they both lived in Hemel Hempstead as well at the time. But John said, I'm a newsreader, freelance newsreader at BFBS at Paddington. How do you fancy auditioning for a post there, along with people like Patrick Lunt, Jan Leeming's late husband? So I said, that's terrific. So I went in for that and I got that job. So during the week, Monday to Friday, 6 p.m, I would be working at television film studios at Ealing. Vivian, my current wife, I mean, she wasn't my wife then, but she is now, she had a flat in Ealing. So I would go for 2 or 3 hours kip in her sitting room or spare room or wherever it was before going into Paddington to do the midnight to 6 a.m. shift. Purely news reading. It was rip and read from the Radio 2 feed that was sent out to BFBS, and or listen and record bulletins of Radio 4, and then I would, mix and match when the rip and read service stopped. I'd mix and match stories to put into hourly bulletins on BFBS.
Was this moonlighting, or was it part of your BBC job?
BFBS was nothing to do with the BBC. Local radio was, so I did local radio under a staff contribution scheme, and it had all sorts of strange consequences with the tax office because everything got very muddled up. It was all sorted out in the end, but that was basically a staff contribution thing. BFBS was nothing to do with the BBC at all, other than it was sort of BBC related in that it was fed the Rip and Read service from Radio 2. All local radio stations had this Rip and Read facility where the Radio 2 newsroom in London would produce a bulletin, and they'd send it out to all the local radio stations, and it was all in script form, so it was ready for broadcast. You just literally ripped off the printer and read what was there and matched it in with other local news, so you've got a bit of national news and a bit of local news as well. So BFBS in a way was affiliated to the BBC in that it took BBC material to rebroadcast to the forces abroad. And Patrick Lunt and me and various other people, they were either current or former BBC people over the years. And it was up to us to have full, because we were on our own at night in the building with one security guard who you could never find to let you out of the studio. But anyway, or let you in to the studio to relieve the outgoing shift person. BFBS ran a news service as well as a general, pop music information program, documentary, all sorts of things like that on radio, quite separate from the SSVC. SSVC was BFBS's parent, and SSVC, the Services Sound and Vision Company or Corporation, they'd produce the TV stuff. BFBS would purely be the radio, British Forces Broadcasting Service radio, linked with the BBC. So all we had to do over the 6-hour night shift was sort of be presenter, editor, producer, all rolled into one, and do that on our own. That was quite good training for newsy sort of stuff. And then I go back to a darkened cutting room at Ealing for Monday to Friday and have a nice little snooze in the corner. Well, no, I didn't really. But being an assistant film editor, you had to completely organise the cutting room for your editor. So when the dailies or the rushes came in from location, you'd have to sync them up, get them rubber numbered so that that was a numbering system that was printed down the side of the picture and the magnetic 16mm sound. So it didn't matter how many times you cut the picture up or the sound up, you could usually find a bit that it belonged to if you wanted to extend it and all sorts of things like that. And you had to log it all, and scene and takes, and then you'd supply the editor with what he needed. And then it would come to dubbing a film, so you used to do track laying, which was great fun. I loved the sound side of it. Do the track laying, and quite often on things like Lovejoy and Schools programme, they'd say to me, you've got a sort of a radio type voice. Can you just pop down to the dubbing theatre and record a few lines for the radio in Lovejoy's kitchen when he comes down in the morning, turn the radio on, he wants to hear a radio programme. Some of that was scripted, some of it was made up. In one episode, the radio turns on and there's me in the background. Very strange.
But this work with film in Ealing was for co-productions, was it?
The productions was an offshoot of film department in that the studio would make a documentary for WGBH or WNET in the United States, and that would be PBS, so public broadcasting in the United States. They would take BBC programmes, film documentaries and program dramas, all sorts of things. But for them to get that material, the cutting room would supply us with a final mix and a music and effects track, along with the master negative and picture. And the job in co-productions was to have the negative copied, which was a CRI, a colour reversal interneg, and we would then copy the final mix and the M&E, which basically was music and effects with no commentary on it. So that those three elements would be sent to the co-producer via the BBC shipping office at Heathrow, and then they could put their own voices on for either for dramas or for documentary narration and that sort of thing. But they had the elements to produce the BBC version, but for American audience or wherever it was going. Clive Gifford ran co-productions, and he was based in Enterprises at the top of Wood Lane, just the other side of the flyover if you were coming from Shepherd's Bush Green, in that very low building that used to exist opposite what was the White City Stadium, but not quite opposite, diagonally opposite the White City Stadium, which got pulled down, and then White City got built there, didn't it? After stage 5 of Television Centre was extended to a big question mark. Stage 6. Was it stage 6? Was it? Yes.
There was never a full stop.
Was there never a full stop on the question mark?
No.
I think it's absolutely ironic that the BBC has sold Television Centre and yet is renting back studio space. I suppose the overheads of keeping a studio running, complex like that with 8 studios or whatever, was very high. But I mean, when I was at Ealing, the sensible editors and assistants, when Maggie Thatcher came along and said, right, there must be, whatever it was, 25% independent production, the sensible editors and assistants said, right, we're going to leave the BBC, or you can make us redundant, take lots of BBC licence payer money with us, and we'll set up as our own company and we'll sell ourselves back to the BBC to carry on working in exactly the same way as we were before, but for probably 3 times the amount of money. I mean, I don't know the economics of that, but that's what a lot of them did. And still, even now, on television recently, there was a programme, Agatha Christie programme, called Why Didn't They Ask Evans? A 3-part drama, and I noticed in the credits at the end it was edited by a chap called Ian Farr, who was one of my colleagues at Ealing in the 1980s. So it's some of them went on to be big editors like that on sort of almost commercial films, dramas, etc. for independent television and all sorts of places, and some did whatever they did. Like I left there because the interest in my voice was beginning to emerge, and then I went to Canada in 1981. And my cousin said, oh, you ought to be on the radio. I said, why is that? Is that because I don't have an accent? He said, no, you have the accent, I don't. And I said, no, I'm sorry, Canadians have an accent. I don't have an accent because I'm British, I'm English. Therefore, I don't have an accent. And that got me thinking about applying up the radio newsreader road.
Yes.
And I went in for interviews with radios 2, 3 and 4. 2 was quite close. I had 2 interviews with them over a couple of years. I had 2 interviews, I think, with Radio 4 and the wonderful Peter Donaldson. Mm-hmm. And Radio 3, Piers Plowright, I think it was, who interviewed me, was absolutely right. He said, I get the impression, Michael, that you don't listen to Radio 3 an awful lot. He'd given me a script. He said, imagine yourself at the Opera House in Covent Garden and you're introducing an opera. Well, opera is not my thing at all. So there's some jolly pieces, Die Fledermaus and those sort of what I call slightly light-hearted, more tuneful, less operatic type things are quite manageable.
It was light opera.
Light opera, yes, that's right. And Gilbert and Sullivan, which is very light opera. Yes. And so that didn't get very far. And I said, yes, you're absolutely right. I didn't like to say that actually I can't hear Radio 3 when I'm driving in from Croydon because you can never pick it up on the wireless because it's so quiet. That was just about the time when Classic FM was coming in and they bunged everything through Optimod so you can hear all the classics in perfect clarity wherever you were listening.
Compressed.
Yes. Well, the Enterprises part, the co-productions under Enterprises banner, that was for about 18 months. And I then moved on to actually apply for a proper film department assistant film editor training post, which took place in the White House over 6 weeks in Ealing Studios. So that I'd left co-productions and I'd actually joined film department properly to be an assistant editor. The editor would do all the cutting. I would do all the, I was going to say the interesting stuff.
Track laying
and logging and running a cutting room and being able to find one frame in 50 million and all that sort of thing. and it was going to lead me on to something. Oh, that's right. Yes, I was asked at one point if I would. This particular editor I was with, I worked with a chap called Richard Seal, who was a wonderful editor. He's moved on to other things now, but he did a lot of everyman films and religious programmes. And I remember we worked on a film with a lovely lady called Angela Tilby, and it was about Lourdes, and they had 2 cameras and they had 2 sound recorders. One sound recorder was attached to the main mixing desk, and there was one sync camera and there was one wild track camera and recorder. Well, I don't know whether you know Lourdes. I'd never been there. It's an enormous site. So when the sound leaves the sound desk over the PA system, it arrives at the far outcrops of the complex at a different time from when it left. And so I had to match up on a double-headed pick sync, so that it had 2 picture heads and it had 2 audio heads. I had to get everything into sync as though it was all working perfectly without this great lag in sound, because of the physics of sound travelling, etc., at the speed that it does, to get it all set, all in sync. And Richard said, "Oh no, there is absolutely no need to do overtime. Absolutely no need whatsoever. If we're scheduled the right amount of time, there is no reason why we can't cut a documentary in 6 weeks or whatever it was." So he was rather against overtime, which was nice because I could then go to choir practice and all that sort of thing. But on this one thing, I said, "Do you mind if I just do a couple of hours more, because I'm nearly there?" And it was so rewarding to have all these piles of film, picture and sound and everything, and I knew it was all in sync, which made it very much easier for him to cut. That was one thing that I really enjoyed doing. And another thing, we worked on, at the time, it was a definitive version of Ernest Hemingway's life, and it was overseen by Alan Yentob, who is still going strong with these documentaries. It was something like, it had to go out on a German broadcaster on Boxing Day one year. Well, when I joined the team, I was the 10th assistant editor in 10 months. It had been running for 10 months already, and it was going to go on another 10 months. And I worked with the wonderful Pam Bosworth, one of the leading lights in film editing from very early on in film history, because there were no women in film production way back, 35mm and all that sort of thing. She was a wonderful lady. And I worked with a dubbing editor called Joe Walker. Well, Joe Walker turned out to go and work in Hollywood, and he's now not only an Oscar nominee, but an Oscar winner for Dune, and he's working on Dune 2, which is due to come out, and he's worked on various other things like Arrival, and he was the editor on Blade Runner 2049, or I'm not quite sure on the film title. So I worked with him as a dubbing editor on Hemingway. I was Pam's assistant, but Joe was the dubbing editor, and he had his own assistant. And I worked on this for 10 months. And occasionally things got a little bit tense, so Pam and I would go to the back fire escape on the 2nd floor of South Block, I think it was, at Ealing, and we'd scream out over Walpole Park. And all was well, and then we go back and carry on. But I remember we did something like 80-hour weeks for 4 weeks, something like that.
This is why they had 10 assistants in an equal number of months.
Yes, exactly. Because I think the assistants, they couldn't cope with it. But I took to Pam, and I think she must have taken to me, and we worked well together. And it all came right in the end. The programme also had to be shortened by I don't know how many hours, because it was far too long. And I think it got reduced down to 3 1.5 hour or 4 1.5 hour documentaries or something like that from a gazillion hours. Ernest Hemingway's got quite a lot of history there, and it was an interesting programme to work on.
I think it would be useful if you just told us a bit about dubbing and the dubbing theatres at Ealing, because I remember working in them from the pre-rock and roll days.
Yes.
You had to get it right.
Yes, that's right. when I was at Ealing, this would have been, I would have said, about 1982 to 1990. Theatre B was the main dubbing theatre, and they had these wonderful machines upstairs, and in the projection room you could have as many, well, I can't remember why I say as many tracks as you like. You do a dialogue mix first, so all the audio tracks would be put up on their separate machines upstairs, and your dubbing mixer would be downstairs looking through the glass at a big screen in the distance, over quite a big open space where you could do Foley or you could do spot effects or whatever, and those are always quite fun, and chopping people's heads off with cabbages and dropping them into a wicker basket, that was always quite effective for a sound effect, and Leaves, which was a scrumpled up 1/4-inch tape.
Yes.
You'd rustle that to make it sound like leaves in a forest, and there were lots of sound effects that could be played in from the chap on the gram deck, and there was probably a tape deck there or two as well. If sound recordists had been really kind, they would stop, as they did on Lovejoy, they would stop everybody in the location they were, and they would say, I just need 1 minute's worth of Atmos, and they'd give us 60 seconds of Atmos, which we could loop from every single location that they filmed in, which was absolute luxury. I mean, there often wasn't time to do that, and certainly not on documentaries. But they did go to great lengths to give the cutting room as much material as they needed to make the thing work. And I think Lovejoy was a very successful series. So yes, we'd probably go in there for a day, possibly 2 days, depending on whether it was a documentary or a drama. And as you say, that the old rock and roll, it was backwards and forwards. And as an assistant editor, I would have to make up the dubbing charts. So I might have 6 or 8 dialogue tracks on large, bigger than A3, I think they were, pieces of paper, almost square pads, and you'd list all the tracks, and you'd mark the footages from naught, and where track 1 would come in at 12 feet and would be whatever it was, and then another track would come in on track 2. You flip-flop between tracks, so you always had an overlay or an overlap, so you could mix between the two, and you always gave longer audio than was actually necessary, so that the dubbing mixer had got something to fade into or fade out from, so you wouldn't bump between shots, which made everything just sound normal and natural and everything. And we'd often go out and buy some shopping in whatever the supermarket was in Ealing. And if there was a scene with we'd only go out and buy the shopping if there was a scene in the film that needed somebody to unpack their shopping when they came home in their kitchen. We could do it visually on screen with what we were seeing to a microphone actually in the live area of the dubbing theatre. And of course that was another benefit of having worked with microphones. You weren't sort of frightened of them, and you knew they were going to pick things up. And somebody said to me one day, when you're on air, never say anything in front of a microphone that you wouldn't want your grandmother to hear. And I'll tell you a story about that when we get onto Bush House. But that was a sage piece of advice that 1 or 2 people around the world might have liked to have taken note of. And there was often a case in churches when we've been singing evensongs, although I don't think I've ever heard it, but the story may be apocryphal, appropriate enough for church, where the vicar or the bishop has gone to the loo just before the service and has already turned his microphone on.
Yes, right.
But yes, where were we? Dubbing.
One interesting thing about dubbing is how you make sure that the thing is going to be right for the average television set as opposed to right for the dubbing theatre.
Yes, indeed. In Theatre B at Ealing, there was a little speaker on the mixing desk. And so the dubbing mixer would often switch off the big, I don't know, they were Rogers, whatever they were, lovely speakers, Rogers, big studio speakers. He would switch those off and play the output through this tiny little speaker, which represented a TV speaker. Yes. And that was a tremendous guide to what would work and what wouldn't work.
Yes.
So that was how we got over that one, because there'd be nothing worse than you making a wonderful mix on big speakers that would grace the Odeon Leicester Square, but you couldn't actually hear the dialogue if you watched it on television. No point at all. So that's how we got around that one. There was one occasion where somebody said to me, "Have you ever done a narration before, a documentary narration?" I said, "No, I haven't." "Oh, would you like to do the narration on this school's programme about the paranormal in Scotland?" I said, "All right then, well, let's have a go." You can always say
Yes.
rubbish. So they gave me the script. I went into the little dubbing theatre, which I think must have been in East Tower, in, what did they call it, the Starship, which was a whizzy dubbing theatre with lots of flashing lights and big screen, and that was the place to do your dubbing. It overlooked the tube line, so when we were standing outside waiting for something to happen, we'd watch the trains going up and down. Great fun. But yes, so I sat in there, and off we went, and came out afterwards, and assistant dubbing mixer said, "You've done that before, haven't you?" "No, first time." "Really?" So with those little sort of examples, and it went out, and my cousin very kindly said to me, "How very appropriate that somebody as abnormal as you should be doing a programme about the paranormal." Yes, and that led me on to going to Canada to see family, and them saying, why aren't you on radio, sort of thing. And then I applied for the various trainee jobs that came up on radios 2, 3 and 4. And then there was this other job advertised. It was something called newsreader announcer external services. What are the external services? Never heard of them. And of course, it was that wonderful building in the Strand, Bush House. And to the rest of the BBC, Bush House was, I think, probably on another planet. Nobody knew much about it. They certainly didn't know what went on there. So I thought, well, this sounds quite fun. So I went along, and I think it was Penny Turk, the then head of presentation. She interviewed me. I had a voice test and a face-to-face interview. I think I may have had another voice test after a short list. And they said, "Oh, we'll give you a 6-month attachment." So I was attached to 2 very experienced announcers, John Wing, who was very old school and very proper and very dapper, always very smart, turned up for work with a handkerchief in his top jacket pocket, and Julian Potter, who was 6 foot something or other, both great fun, and I learnt an awful lot from them. And so that was 6 months not on air, but literally of learning how the World Service worked, because everything ran to GMT. So in the summer the studios were GMT, but the rest of the building was in BST. So you had to be terribly careful with the rotors, that the rotors were published in BST to get you into the right studio at the right time for GMT. You can see the confusion that could arise.
How interesting. Yeah.
And it was very complicated. There was one continuity suite at the time called Green, and on certain days of the week in the afternoon there would be another continuity suite called Purple. All the networks in Bush House, from whatever language they were, English was Green with an offshoot called Purple, and then all the other languages would have brown, red, magenta, orange, pink, all these different colours for the different networks in the different languages that were all being broadcast simultaneously, mostly, around the world, depending on the daytime hours in the country of their target audience. But it all had to be encapsulated in Bush House with computers to do all the automatic switching. But basically shortwave would be broadcast from Daventry or Wooferton or 1 or 2 other places in Britain, and they would use the ionosphere to bounce the shortwave signal off, because it was like a reflector. And it would bounce down to a relay station somewhere, then it would back up to the ionosphere and back down again. The trouble was, when the sun decided to have a few flares, that would create a hole in the ionosphere. And the particular layer of the ionosphere which was particularly of importance to shortwave broadcasters was the F layer. And it was A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I think, and it was the F layer that did all the work to get the signals around the world on shortwave. When there was a flare from the sun, that would often create a hole, which was known as the F hole. And your signal would go on a straight line, and at the moment I'm broadcasting on Pluto. I'm not quite sure what the frequency is, but you can probably hear me. If you go out there quickly enough, you'll be able to catch my radio waves coming in when there was a severe ionospheric disturbance.
So what did they do when there was a serious disturbance?
Well, there were often more than one transmitter around the world to relay the signals. This is all pre-FM, no satellites involved, or very early stages of satellites. And we often had to do service announcements to say, we'd like to apologise, but due to severe ionospheric disturbances in whatever area, frequencies from the so-and-so transmitter may not have been heard. Now, may not have been heard was if we'd say that if there was a second transmitter broadcasting the same material on the same frequency. They could have picked up the transmission from one or other transmitter. If there was only one transmitter broadcasting on one frequency, we're very sorry, you were unable to hear the program. This was due to a severe ionospheric disturbance. And we had to log the sender numbers. So at wherever it was, and there will be loads of people who will know what I'm talking about, but I just can't remember. The transmitting stations had senders, which were the piece of high voltage equipment which would send the signal up through a particular array of aerials in a field, and so we had to give a log for sender 47 wasn't broadcasting on 12095 kilohertz or whatever it was, and we'd have to fit all these sort of technical bits of information into the everyday broadcasts.
Yes. Can I just stop you there?
Yeah, sure.
For a lot of parts of the world, you would transmit on one wavelength for a certain amount of the time, and then it would switch, wouldn't it, to another wavelength?
That's right. That's right.
Presumably that became audible.
Well, every 6 months there would be a convention of international broadcasters who broadcast on shortwave, and they'd meet up and they'd decide what frequencies there would be available, because it would be summer in one part of the world and winter in the other part of the world, and frequencies would work differently in both areas, so not all the frequencies that they used in summer would be available in winter and vice versa. And so there'd be a big discussion of who wanted to use what frequencies and when, which is why at World Service every 14 minutes and 15 seconds there would be a transmitter silence for 2 seconds to allow frequencies to switch off and probably be taken up by another broadcaster somewhere else, Voice of America or what was the one in Israel? There was a big international broadcaster in Israel. There would be international broadcasters vying for the same frequencies because nature dictated that there were only those frequencies you could broadcast on to send your signal to wherever. So there was a sort of bit of give and take as to who wanted what people could use. And so that would change. And so we would say, and the program was produced by so-and-so and so-and-so, pause, and then some listeners from that previous transmission would still be with you because they wouldn't have left. You couldn't back announce the program that had just left because the people who left wouldn't hear your back announcement for what was going to be on at the same time tomorrow or next week. So you had to sort of be fairly sort of neutral in what you said for 11 seconds, and there'd be another 2 seconds silence when a whole load of other transmission frequencies would join you. And once they join you, you could say, welcome to BBC World Service, but you couldn't backtrail what would be on tomorrow in the last half an hour because they wouldn't know what you're talking about because they can't hear the World Service at that time. So there had to be...
This is immensely complicated.
Incredibly complicated. And we had a planning department and a scheduling department. And yes, it was incredibly complicated. And Terry Spillane would create these wonderful A3 schedules with everything we needed to know of what to do when. So all the silences were marked, the programs were on, the programmes were shown, and everything was done to the second, and then programmes would produce their own publicity, either in written form, trails, or promotions, which were usually on Modarts or carts in the early days, sometimes on tape, and we had reel-to-reel tape recorders or replay machines, 2 of them, in the cons, and a gram player, and cart or Modart machines to play out jingles and promotions and that sort of thing. And we just had to, not everything ran to the allocated slot, obviously, as long as it didn't run over. Otherwise, it would just get cut off, because the computer would say, goodbye, and cut you off, and that would be that. Another frequency would take over. So you had to fill, which was quite fun. Sometimes when I did proms, we occasionally presented proms from the box next to the Radio 3 box in the Albert Hall. One highlight of that, well, I suppose it was a highlight, television was in, and when television turned up at the proms, there was always problems. Sorry, people who worked in telly, but there were 2 grand pianos, and they weren't quite on their spot for the camera in the arena, so they had to move it. But we were live, and so while all this was going on, I had to fill the gap. We got I said, now listen out for the people in the gallery will say heave, and everybody in the arena will say ho when they lift the lid on each of the grand pianos. And on my cue, they did precisely that. Terrific, marvellous, wonderful listening. But then I had to keep going because I'd run out of what I was going to say on my script. I started to read from the backup information about Albert, about Queen Victoria, the history of the hall, and I started on the programme notes, bar the advertisements, before all was well to go ahead. Yes. Unfortunately, all that got cut out of the repeat, but it was all there in the original. I think it was 12 minutes I had to fill for. So that was quite fun. But yeah, we'd as long as you didn't crash the silence, it was as bad as not paying a TV license, more or less. Right. You never crashed a silence.
You spent, nearly 20 years, did you, in Bush House?
1990, I started at Bush House with Gulf War 1, and I ended in 2011, just before all the business about taxation and pensions and all that lot changed.
21 years. Yes.
21 years.
Golly.
And there wasn't just continuity, that was just the continuity side of it. There was the newsroom side as well, so we'd read the news as well. We'd do sport. I was never really into sport, but John Wing taught me how to do sport, and that was reasonably successful, even if I hadn't got a clue who I was talking about. Pronunciations were paramount. They still are to me. Pronunciation unit would supply all the names and places if we didn't know what they were. There would be a fabulous card index in Continuity Suite in Centre Block, and also in the newsroom in South East Wing, where we could look stuff up. But after a while, they computerised it all, and so you phoned up the pronunciation unit in BH, and they'd tell you what it was. Chris Chaplin, who was a senior announcer at Bush, he invented a computer system on a BBC Micro. That's right. He invented a program for that, and I would put in a lot of the names and everything from that day's broadcasts and everything, which was fascinating. We had our own way of doing. Not the dictionary way of doing accents and stresses and all that sort of thing, but there was the BBC phonetics way of doing things. And even today, down by my chair here, I have the pronunciation guide produced by the BBC Library and Information Research Services of Chinese syllables. So I still use that when I'm reading The Economist, and I use it, even to this day. Pronunciation was most important, and we had to understand the story. I would never get nervous, if I could help it, before a broadcast, whether it was a 9-minute straight read, whether it was a 5-minute, whether it was a 5 minutes into News Hour or News Desk, or I was presenting News Desk, which was usually a double-headed programme with 2 announcers from presentation and production team, or whether it was the slow-speed news for BBC English. The slow speed news for BBC English was fascinating, because you took a 5-minute bulletin and you read one line for 4 seconds. So perhaps there's another way of putting it. You had to make sure that one line of text lasted 4 seconds. So it was read relatively slowly, but with full of understanding, without being a local radio sing-song version of the news.
This was for people learning English.
This was for people learning English.
As a second language, yes. Very important.
Particularly in China.
I don't think they do it anymore, do they?
I'm not quite sure what they do in that area now. I think there is still something where you can learn through the BBC, but I'm not awfully sure what it is.
Yeah.
But that was mainly done for China. And then once we'd done our slow speed news, the same bulletin was broadcast in Chinese following the slow speed news. So ours would take 9 minutes, and then there would be 5 minutes of the same news in Chinese. And a professor in China wrote a paper on the propaganda that was being spread by the BBC News in this slow speed version, so that they could pass on secret messages to wherever. All sorts of
that's wonderful
stuff. But I always say, if you're in front of a microphone, never say anything you wouldn't want your grandmother to hear, as in the case, I think, is of one of the Bushes, presidents of the United States, who was waiting to start a press conference, and somebody came in that he knew, and he said, "Oh, look, there's that major league asshole, so-and-so and so-and-so." Unfortunately, in a certain way, the BBC World Service rebroadcast this verbatim by the newsreaders. The male newsreaders said asshole, the female newsreaders said arsehole. At which point there were many complaints which came in from Americans living abroad, saying that was extremely offensive and how dare the BBC use such language. So there you are.
Even if it was the president who said it. Yes, quite. But I mean, you spent an awfully long time at Bush House. It is a fascinating, or it was a fashion. I don't know if
it was an amazing
house now. It was an amazing place.
It was an amazing building
with every culture you could imagine.
Yes, there were 44 or so languages when I was there, and you go down to the canteen and you'd hardly ever hear English spoken. It was a mini United Nations. Everybody got on with everybody. I think we had the Hindis opposite us on the 7th floor of Centre Block, opposite presentation. You know, great fun. We'd know people in all sorts of areas. We'd read the news for Network Africa and Focus on Africa, morning and evening. They were a fabulous place to work, fabulous sort of network to work on.
Presumably the canteen was serving all kinds of food from all kinds of different parts of the world.
It was indeed. And breakfasts were wonderful, because at the time of Edwina Curry and no soft eggs were allowed, we used to go down, I've forgotten the name of the lady who ran the canteen, ran the breakfast service in those days. She said, "If you want a soft-boiled egg, I will give you a soft-boiled egg. Doesn't matter what Edwina Curry says. You have what you want, and I will get it for you." It was wonderful. It was absolutely wonderful. And, of course, the newsroom at Bush, they would write the news from the agencies or correspondents or stringers or whatever for the whole of World Service output. So they would make a core of the important stories for world news, and they would distribute them to the language services, who would then translate them into their appropriate language, but then they would also have their own news for their part of the world. You know, and many people came from, you know, behind the Iron Curtain, as it was, to work at Bush House, where they could have freedom of expression to broadcast back into their repressed countries, Burma, places like that. I think it was a fatal sentence if you were caught listening to the World Service in Burma. There was the famous story of Georgy Markov, of course, who left Bush House to walk across Waterloo Bridge and got spiked with an umbrella. And that was
Ricin,
him.
Wasn't it?
Pardon me?
wasn't it? Ricin.
Yes, Ricin. Yes,
Yes.
yes, that's right. But yes, it was a wonderful building. It wasn't built for broadcasting because it cost the BBC or it cost whoever a fortune to clear the BBC out. Millions, I think, because it was false floors and false ceilings and miles of cable. And I bid for in the auction the DAT machine and the CD burner from Continuity, and even the studio clock that I stared at for 21 years. I have all those things.
Great, you bought one of those.
I bought
Great.
one of those. Yes,
Yes.
I just need the electrical unit that will make the second hand work. in BBC fashion, but yes, it was a terrific place to work. It really was. I could wax lyrical for hours. I think probably on that.
So you were at Bush House before anything was discussed about moving it all out.
Yes, I mean, we knew it was coming. I think by the time I got to... No, they moved out in 2012, didn't they? And I left in 2011. But we all... I mean, lots of ex-B people turned up at Bush House to see the final broadcast in NewsHour before it handed over to BH. That was a very emotional day, I can tell you. In 2010, I was offered redundancy. Would you like to take redundancy, Michael? No, thank you. I enjoy working with the people too much and what the World Service means to the world. I mean, it was about the listener. It wasn't about somebody's strange idea, let's change this, let's change that, just for the sake of changing it. The audience was always the most important person. And then I was asked the same question in 2011. And I said, well, show me the paperwork. If I'd gone on beyond the 6th of March 2011, if I had been made redundant within the next 5 years and had received redundancy pay, I could have had that taxed at 40% for the whole lot, and not the tax-free allowance which you got up to a certain amount. And the other thing was that if I had stayed on, my pension could have been cut by 25%. So really? The figures just said, don't stay. So I didn't. And it was a very, very sad day to leave, moving out of this wonderful, wonderful building.
Now, after you left the BBC, left Bush House,
yep.
You went on doing some broadcasting, I think, and you're still broadcasting.
Yes, I am. I took a year off just to get myself back to normal. Many people say I never have been normal, so why try now? But they said, I bet you bought a microphone and you went around with a little piece of string attached to the back of it. I actually bought myself a AKG C414 because I thought perhaps in the future it might become useful. I now have all sorts of bits of technical kit. And after a year out of the BBC, I think Jim Lee got in touch with me. He said, we're looking for another voice as a reader for the Economist audio edition. The Economist newspaper produces their thing every week, and they now do, and have been doing for quite a number of years, an audio edition, so you can listen to it rather than have to read it if you're driving or whatever, Yeah. So I've been doing that, I'm amazed to say, since 2011 to date. So we keep doing that. Don't understand a word of it. I've just about got to terms with and the. No, it's very world servicing content. It's not all financial. So I sort of feel at home with it, even if the material isn't written for the spoken word. Some of it is beautifully written. Some of it isn't written by an English speaker necessarily, because they're specialists in their field from wherever they are in the world, and certainly not meant to be read out loud. But if you convince most of the people most of the time you know what you're talking about, half the battle is won. Yeah. So I do that from the dining room instead of a production house in London since COVID, which is where I'm talking to you from now. Dinner will be served shortly.
Right. If we go any longer, it will be. Yeah.
Yes. We'll have afternoon tea first.
Right. Okay. That's excellent. So you've continued to use the skills that the BBC taught you.
Yes, absolutely. And my music.
And you do it from home.
Yes, I do. I go out to do my music in cathedrals and wonderful churches around the country, which is fabulous. And I have to say that retirement is a very busy career. How did I ever have time to go to work? I bet that sounds familiar.
I never went to work. We always used to say this is better than working.
Well, I sum up my career, my working career, as being paid to do my hobby. And, you know, if you're fortunate enough to be able to say that, how wonderful. Yes.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Michael, for doing this. It's very, very interesting. And you've touched on areas of the BBC I didn't even know existed, which is one of the great joys of doing this sort of 100 Voices project.
Well, I'm very glad, David. It's been a great pleasure to do. And as you probably gathered, I rather enjoyed my time in the BBC.